Our scriptures today are Exodus 20, 1 through 17, and Psalm 19, 7 through 10. I'll start in Exodus. If you would like to follow along, the Pew Bible would be page 118 and then 858. So starting in Exodus 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or in earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for their sin of the father to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor your alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, or his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now we'll move to Psalm 19, verses 7 through 10. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They're more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. So for the last couple weeks, we have been working with this theme of what's between us and God, and we've been looking at a number of the covenants that are between God and man, and just talking about how they can either serve to draw us closer to God, or sometimes they work as an obstacle between us and God. So today we want to look at the 10 Commandments, and then see how that works in both those ways, and also in what ways God is wanting to reformat us, change us from the inside out to see them perhaps in a new way. So, what are our feelings about commandments and rules in general? How do you feel about the commands that you just heard? We read over them. What did that stir within you? The psalmist that we read has really strong feelings about God's law. And I don't know about you, but if I hadn't read this, and I read the 10 Commandments, and someone told me to list how I felt about it, it wouldn't be, wow, this is better than gold or honey. Those wouldn't have been the words that came to mind. I think often we have a bit of a negative opinion, even if it's subconscious, about rules in general, laws, and sometimes that spills over into God's law. And at the very least, we probably don't talk about them in the way the psalmist did. Now, perhaps some of you do, but I think many of us, especially outside of the church, don't have that view. So today I'd like to look at perhaps why we have a bit of a negative view when we look at rules, and what we can do to kind of change that view into something more perhaps like what the psalmist had. First, rules, they provide a necessary boundary. I know I've had times in my life where I've said, man, I wish there were just no rules. But I think I really didn't think that through. Because rules, they give this framework for us to do things inside of. If you think about, I like games and sports, so I like using those type analogies. But if you think about a game that you like, something simple like Uno, and then imagine what that would be like if you played that with someone and there were no rules. So maybe there's a green 2 out there and you have a blue 6. Oh, there's no rules. I'm just going to lay that. The other person's going to be confused. Why did you do that? Well, there's no rules and I felt like it. Maybe you just lay your whole hand down. I won. Game over. That's what it's like when there's no rules. If you think about sports, many sports have a boundary, like soccer and football. If you cross over that boundary, you break that rule, you're outside of the game. If those weren't there, can you imagine what it would be like? There's no boundaries. I'm just going to take my football and I'm going to run in that direction for as long as I can, because that's how I feel like playing. So these boundaries, these rules, they give us a framework from which to work inside of. And it's the same with God's law. They provide a boundary for which us to live flourishingly if we stay inside that boundary. So we need rules, okay. But how about this? Have you ever said, well, these rules are terrible. I wish I could make my own rules. If you've ever thought something like that, I would invite you to pay attention to what's motivating that. Like right before you said, these rules are terrible, what was going on? What was happening that made you say these rules are terrible? My guess is that you'll find out it's because you want something. You feel like you're being told that you can't have something you want. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later. So, but there's other people. This is a popular, or it's a thought that many people have. I wish I could make the rules, I could do a better job. And some people have decided just that they could do a better job at making the commandments than God did. And I found this article on CNN. What if instead of climbing Mount Sinai to receive the 10 commandments from God, Moses had turned to the Israelites and asked, hey, what do you guys think? Considering the Hebrews' bad behavior in the Bible, with coveting their neighbors' wives and murdering their own brothers, that might have been a disastrous idea. But that was a long time ago, and a lot's changed. We've evolved. But in our more enlightened age, we're perfectly capable of crowdsourcing our own commandments. Or at least that's what a new project would have us believe. Lex Bayer, who's an executive at the Airbnb, and John Figador is a humanist chaplain at Stanford University, they delivered their own 10 non-commandments in a book they co-wrote called Atheist Heart, Humanist Mind. They had a contest to come up with these 10 non-commandments, in which more than 2,800 submissions were submitted from 18 countries and 27 U.S. states. And then Bayer and Figador, they put together a team of 13 people, 13 judges, to select the top 10 non-commandments. And this isn't a joke. This is actually a rising denomination right now across the world called the Atheist Megachurch. And they hold services in buildings just like this, and it looks exactly like this. They sing songs, and they have people give a sermon. And now they have their own 10 non-commandments, which I'd like to read for you. So, number 1, non-commandment. Be open-minded. Be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence. Strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true. The scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. Every person has the right to control of their body. God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life. Be mindful of the consequences of all your actions and recognize that you must take responsibility for them. Number 7, treat others as you would want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. Think about their perspective. Number 8, we have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations. Number 9, there is no one right way to live. And number 10, leave the world a better place than you found it. So, if we don't like the rules as they are, we can simply make our own. We can revert to making them ourselves. However, I think if you look closely at these, you will see that we're really left with no rules at all. And we all know how that can end, because we talked about what it looks like when there are no rules. From the very beginning, they called these the non-commandments. So they're not commands. At best, these are the 10 suggestions for how you might live. And a lot of them are really good. Be open-minded. Strive to understand. Every person has the right to control their own body. Treat others as you would want them to treat you. That one sounds familiar. But then I get really confused when we get to number 9. There's no one right way to live. So they give all these suggestions and things that are non-commandments, but at least suggestions, and then it's, well, there's no one right way to live anyway, which kind of counterintuitive to all the rest of the things that were just said. So I don't know if we really did a better job or not. I think we're really left with no commandments at all. But all of this comes out of a kind of aversion to having to follow the rules, to having God's law. So why the aversion to rules in God's law? Why do we have trouble seeing it like the psalmist did? I think it's 2 things: view and understanding. So what do I mean by view? There's 3 things in how we view God's commandments. First, how do we imagine God giving the 10 commandments? I think this is really important. Some people have a theology or an understanding that the way God gave the commandments was a punishment. You bad Israelites, you've done a terrible job of getting it right so far. Now I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to give you these 10 commandments. You're going to have to live by them. If that's how we view God giving the 10 commandments, then naturally, we're not going to think real highly of them. It's like an angry parent setting up rules because we couldn't get it right. But there's another way to look at them. We can see it as a gift for how God desired good life for all. We'll have another imagining time here. We imagined what it would look like if there were no rules. Now I invite you to just for a minute imagine what it would look like. Imagine what earth would look like if everyone just followed the 10 commandments. Now I know that's not true and it's impossible, but just imagine what it would look like if everyone did. We wouldn't need to lock our house anymore. We wouldn't need to be worried about being attacked or anything like that. If everybody followed the 10 commandments, we would live in a vastly different world. That was God's vision. It was a gift. It's like him saying, listen, this is my heart for you. If you follow this, if you stay within this, life will flourish for all. If we see God, if we view God as giving us his law as a gift, it changes how we view and interpret God's law. The second way that we view God's law is the I versus the you. It's a self-centered view versus an other-centered view. In the I and the you, there's a difference when we focus on ourselves instead of focusing on others. With an I-centered view, things like thou shalt not steal or thou shalt not covet, it becomes an obstacle to getting what you want. So if you're looking at God's law and you're looking at it from the point of view of I, of self, you're seeing something that you want. And then God's law is an obstacle in between you and that. So that becomes your focus. God's law just becomes an obstacle that's keeping you from getting what you want. And then when we're in that I-centered place, we begin making rationalizations for why we should get what we want. Well, it's okay if I steal that because I really need it, or I deserve it. I've worked so hard. I'm justified in making that choice to do that. We begin rationalizing, and then once we've rationalized to make it okay, then we begin looking for loopholes. Let's see. There's a little gray area here in what God was saying. Maybe he intended it this way, but he didn't exactly intend it this way. So we start looking for loopholes. This is exactly why there are constantly more and more rules all the time in our own society. I forget the numbers, but I looked up about the tax code. It started out at some manageable amount of rules, and then it's something to where it's now 74,000 pages of rules. And the reason that is because every year people find new loopholes of how to keep what they want. You may have any kind of opinion on tax, but the idea is the same. When you really want something, you begin looking for a loophole. And then people feel like they have to create more and more rules to keep us from doing that. And what happens is we really don't understand the law at all. We don't understand the intent behind it. And this moves us into our third way of understanding or viewing God's law. The difference between the letter of the law and the value of the law, or the intent of the law. When we understand the intent, the law, we understand the heart of what's behind it and motivating it, we're more likely to get on board with that and to say, okay, I understand, that's good. But when we don't understand a law at all, it's much more easy for us to want to look for a loophole. So an other-centered view is exactly what Jesus was all about during his ministry. He gave us the double love command in Matthew 22. What was happening here in Matthew 22, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law, they came to Jesus and they wanted him to tell them what the most important law was. Because there were all these laws, and it's hard to follow when there's a lot of laws. So they wanted to know, Jesus, what's the most important one? If we've got to follow one, what is that most important law that we really need to make sure we follow? And Jesus replies, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Okay, well, that's not too bad. We can do that. But of course, Jesus isn't good enough, or is not, he's not going to stop at just one. So he follows that up with, that is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, okay, well, that's not too bad. Love God and love yourself. 2, we can handle 2. But Jesus isn't done again. He keeps going. All of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Jesus, we were just asking for one. And now Jesus has incorporated all of the law. He's brought it back into all of it. And it all hangs on these 2. So how do all of the 10 commandments hang on these 2 commands of love? It's because Jesus takes the I out of the equation, and he places the focus on God and on others. And when we do this, then we begin to see these commandments in a new light. Because, thou shalt not commit adultery, it changes it because it's not about I not getting what I want. Because we love God and we love others, we begin to look at that same command in a different way. Because I'm not going to commit adultery because I care about my brother and my sister and my wife. And what is it going to do to them if I make that choice? An other-centered view. Jesus continues in other ways to reframe these 10 commandments, Jesus style. We can see this in the Sermon on the Mount. We could look at any of these, but I've chosen to look at murder for this, and then you can apply the way Jesus is looking at it here to the rest. First, to answer a question, if we were going to play Bible Jeopardy, what would be the answer to why should you not commit murder? Anyone want to hazard a guess? What is God told you so? Wrong. But that's the quick, easy answer we go to, right? Why should you not commit murder? Well, God told me so. It's in the 10 Commandments. But that's the wrong answer, or at least it's not the full answer. And Jesus gets at that here in Matthew 5, 21 through 22 of the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you've heard it said to people long ago that you shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Okay, 10 Commandments, we got that. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in the dangers of the fires of hell. Wow. Have you ever been angry? I have. Are you getting worried? What does Jesus mean? He doesn't mean to never be angry. Jesus himself got angry, drove people out of the temple courts. Of course, we're to get angry. We're to get angry about the same things that make God angry, injustice in the world. So it's not that we don't get angry. What Jesus is reframing and pointing out to us here, that it's about the heart. It matters where our hearts are oriented. If we're getting angry out of a selfish anger, if we're so upset and angry because of something we're not getting or because we feel we've been injured or hurt in a different way, And we're so angry that we wish someone would die or something like that. It's the same as if we had committed murder. That's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is reframing this command. It's not enough to just follow the letter of the law. It's not enough to just not pull the trigger, so to say. Jesus wants his followers to understand, and now we're getting into that last piece of Jesus wanting us to understand, to be able to see the commandments in a new light. He wants his followers to understand why we're not pulling the trigger, why we're not committing murder. Any person who's not a Christian could go through life and choose to follow the 10 Commandments. That's not the point, Jesus is saying. It matters where your heart is. So the hardest aspect of following this commandment is not in keeping the letter of the law. It's not in just following the directions. The hardest part is in loving our enemy, in placing others' interest above our own. Further in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Because he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Jesus wants his followers to understand why the commands have been given. So that brings me to this understanding. How do we understand the heart, the intent behind? And I think that the word why, or the question why, might be the greatest question ever. Why is such a great question? It deserves such a great answer. And I told you so is not it. I know some parents who might disagree. And I've been there. I've been through the stage where every question they ask is, why? Clean up your room. Why? Eat your food. Why? It's time for bed. Why? Oh, I hate that one. Because I told you so. It's so easy to say that. But that's not what God's saying. What God is saying, he gave us Jesus, and that's what he's saying. It's so easy to say, I told you so, but God wants to say, listen to Jesus. Jesus is the answer to those questions, and he wants us to study his word. We should come to the 10 Commandments, and we should ask those why questions. Why is great for other reasons, because why usually ends up ending at another why. You get a good answer, and then that typically leads you to ask another why question. I really like why questions. So we should come to the 10 Commandments, and we should ask why. Thou shalt not steal. Why? We need to understand these things. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Why? We study this, and it gives us new meaning. I've always heard that growing up, don't take the Lord's name in vain, as don't use a cuss word in relation to God's name. And that's a piece of it, but it's so much more. A more direct translation would be something like, don't lift up the Lord's name in vain. And this has to do with those who used to attach God's name to purposes, to organizations and things for their own vain purpose. It's like name dropping God's name because it's going to give you a benefit. When we understand the intent behind the law, they take on a new meaning. So to kind of wrap this up, how we view God, as whether it's a loving parent giving a gift or an angry parent just disciplining, is going to affect how we view God's law. Viewing out of an other orientation instead of an I-centered one will also affect how we view God's law. And a check for this is if you find yourself looking for loopholes when you're studying the Word, pay attention to that. You can catch yourself in I mode. Study God's commands and ask the why question so that you can understand the value of the law instead of just knowing the letter. Even in Exodus 24, when God is giving Moses it, he gives Moses the tablets and said, this is so you can teach them. It wasn't so that they could just memorize the words. It was so that they could be taught the law and understand why God was giving it. And then we can begin to see why the psalmist loved God's law and thought so highly of it. We should notice here, though, that the psalmist nowhere said, "Oh, how easy it is to follow the laws of the Lord. Oh, how simple it is to just follow your commands, God." That was not part of the psalm. It's not simple. It's not easy. We make mistakes. We can look at the Hebrew people. We can look at David, the most famous king. We can look in the New Testament. There's lots of examples of people getting out of step with God's commands. This is also why God gave us Jesus, grace. However, we take a big step to moving closer to being in step with God and with his understanding of his law when we place the value on God's law and we begin to follow them, not because God said so, but because we understand the love God had for us and the intent, and we love others. Join me in prayer. God, we're so thankful for the way that you love us, for the way that you care so deeply for us, that you would give us your law, not out of anger, but out of love, out of a desire to see us flourish. God, I pray that you would continue to move deeply in us, that you would open our eyes and our hearts, that we would understand your commands, your word, more fully, and that we could place ourselves not at the center, but that when we come to those, we could come seeking your honor and grace, and that we could come seeking the benefit for others. In Jesus' name, amen.